At dinner, my mom pointed at me and said, "Yeah, he pays the bills, but he'll always be the dumb one without a degree." My sister snorted. My dad just sipped her wine. I'd bought them that house, paid off their debt, gave them everything. That night, I opened my laptop and started pulling every plug, one by one. I, 32M, stared at my mother's smug face across the dinner table, her words still echoing in my ears. She had just pointed at me like I was some disappointing exhibit and announced to everyone present that while I might pay the bills, I'd always be the dumb one without a degree. My sister let out that familiar snort of agreement, the same sound she'd made since we were kids whenever Mom took shots at me. Dad just kept sipping his wine, the expensive bottle I'd brought from my collection, acting like he hadn't heard anything at all. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in the dining room of the house I'd bought them 3 years ago, after Dad's construction business went under and they were facing foreclosure on their old place. The mortgage payments, the property taxes, the insurance, all came from my account every month. The car payments for both their vehicles, the credit card debt I'd cleared when Mom's shopping addiction nearly bankrupted them. Even the wine Dad was so carefully avoiding eye contact over, everything traced back to my supposedly inferior, degree-less bank account. I dropped out of college at 19 to start my landscaping business. Back then, they'd called it throwing my life away. Mom would introduce me to her friends as her son who was trying to find himself, while Dad would just shake his head whenever someone asked about my future plans. They never saw the early mornings, the back-breaking work, the slow build from a single client to a crew of 12 guys working contracts across 3 counties. All they saw was their disappointment in human form. The landscaping business had evolved into property management, then real estate investment, then a small empire of rental properties and commercial contracts. By 30, I was pulling in more annually than both their previous salaries combined. But somehow, in their minds, I remained the family failure because I didn't have a piece of paper hanging on my wall. My sister worked as a marketing coordinator at some startup, barely scraping by on her salary despite her precious bachelor's degree. She lived in a studio apartment and drove a car that was more rust than metal, but she had graduated summa cum laude, so she was still the golden child. Mom would brag about her daughter, the college graduate, while I sat there, having just finished explaining why their property taxes had gone up and how I'd handle the increase. The conversation at dinner had started innocently enough. Mom was telling Dad about running into their old neighbor at the grocery store, and how the woman had been bragging about her son getting promoted to partner at some law firm. That's when Mom had looked directly at me and made her announcement about degrees and intelligence, as if my financial contributions were just lucky accidents rather than the result of any actual skill or intelligence. I finished my meal in silence while they continued their conversation, acting like nothing had happened. Dad asked about my latest project, and I gave him the basics about a new commercial property I was developing. Mom chimed in with questions about the timeline and budget, suddenly interested in the details of my supposedly inferior work when it affected their comfortable lifestyle. After dessert, I helped clear the table and made small talk about weekend plans. Mom mentioned wanting to redecorate the guest bathroom, and Dad brought up some maintenance issues with the pool equipment. I nodded along, making mental notes about costs and contractors, the same way I always did. They expected me to handle everything, but apparently, my competence was just a happy accident of genetics rather than intelligence. I drove home that night thinking about every sacrifice I'd made for their comfort. The vacations I'd skipped to cover their expenses, the business opportunities I'd passed up because they needed immediate financial help, the relationships I'd let slide because family obligations always came first. I'd built my entire adult life around ensuring they never had to worry about money again, and my reward was being called the dumb one in front of the family. Back at my house, I sat in my home office staring at the laptop screen. The monthly automatic transfers were all laid out in my financial management software: mortgage payment, insurance, utilities, car payments, credit cards, even a generous monthly allowance I'd set up so they wouldn't have to ask for spending money. Thousands of dollars flowing out of my accounts every month to maintain their lifestyle, all because I'd wanted to take care of the people who raised me. I started with the small stuff. The subscription services I'd been paying for, their streaming accounts, Mom's meal delivery service, Dad's golf club membership. A few clicks, and they were all canceled, effective immediately. Then I moved to the credit cards. I'd been covering their monthly payments for 2 years now. ever since Mom's spending had spiraled again. I called the companies and removed myself as an authorized payer, letting them know the account holders would handle their own bills going forward. The car payments were next. Both vehicles were in their names, but the monthly payments came from my account through automatic withdrawal. I canceled the authorizations and sent emails to both of them explaining that they'd need to handle their own transportation costs starting the following month. I was professional about it, almost clinical in my language, explaining that I was restructuring my financial commitments and could no longer provide assistance with their vehicle expenses. The utilities took a bit more work. Most were in my name since I'd set everything up when they moved in, so I had to transfer the accounts back to them. I called each company and explained that the account holder was changing and that I'd cover the final month to give them time to set up automatic payments from their own accounts. The electric company was particularly efficient about it, confirming that the new account holder would receive the first bill in 30 days. The house was the biggest decision. The mortgage was in my name, but the deed listed all three of us as owners. I'd structured it that way to avoid gift tax issues when I bought the place, never imagining I'd want to unwind the arrangement. I sent an email to my attorney asking about options for transferring full ownership, explaining that I wanted to remove myself from all financial obligations related to the property. By midnight, I'd systematically removed myself from every recurring financial obligation to my family. The monthly transfers that had become as automatic as breathing were all canceled. The credit cards, the insurance policies, the maintenance contracts, everything was being transferred back to their responsibility. I calculated the total and realized I'd been spending almost $4,000 a month on their lifestyle, not counting the larger expenses like home repairs or medical bills that came up periodically. I drafted an email explaining the changes, trying to strike a balance between professional and personal. I told them I'd decided to restructure my financial priorities and would no longer be able to provide the monthly support they'd grown accustomed to. I explained that all accounts and services would be transferred to their names over the next 30 days, and that I'd cover one final month of expenses to give them time to adjust their budgets accordingly. The email sat in my drafts folder for an hour while I second-guessed myself. These were my parents, the people who'd raised me and supported me through childhood. Did one thoughtless comment really justify cutting off all financial help? But then I remembered my sister's snorted agreement, Dad's careful avoidance of eye contact, and Mom's casual cruelty in dismissing everything I'd accomplished as the lucky fumbling of someone too stupid to get a degree. I hit send at 1:17 a.m. My phone started ringing at 6:45 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to Mom's increasingly frantic messages throughout the day. She'd tried to order groceries through her delivery service and discovered the account was closed. Dad had gotten a notice from his golf club about overdue membership fees. Their credit card had been declined at lunch, and they discovered I was no longer covering the payments. The messages evolved from confused to angry to desperate over the course of the day. Mom wanted to know what kind of technical glitch had caused all their services to be canceled simultaneously. Dad left a gruff message asking if I was having some kind of financial crisis that I needed help with. By evening, the messages had turned accusatory, with Mom demanding to know why I was punishing them over some silly comment at dinner. I didn't return any of the calls. Update 1. 3 days later, my sister showed up at my office. She'd driven over during her lunch break, still wearing her marketing coordinator badge on a lanyard. She wanted to know what game I was playing and when I planned to stop acting like a child over some harmless family teasing. I explained to her that the teasing had been going on for 13 years, ever since I dropped out of college. That every family gathering included some reference to my lack of education, despite the fact that my supposedly inferior intelligence had been funding their comfortable lifestyle for years. She tried to argue that Mom hadn't meant anything serious by her comment, that it was just her way of expressing disappointment about my educational choices. She asked what I expected them to do now, and I suggested they might try living within their actual means instead of the inflated lifestyle my contributions had made possible. She pointed out that they were both in their 60s, that Dad's back problems made physical work difficult, and that Mom had never developed career skills because she'd been a stay-at-home mother for most of their marriage. I listened to her arguments and acknowledged that the situation would be difficult for them. Then I asked her why she hadn't been contributing to their support despite being so concerned about their welfare now. She explained that her salary barely covered her own expenses, and that she'd assumed I was happy to help since I made so much more money. The conversation lasted almost an hour, with her alternating between anger and pleading. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel, then shifted to asking what it would take for me to reconsider. I told her the financial support had ended permanently, but that I wasn't cutting off emotional relationships. They were welcome to visit, to call, to maintain family connections that didn't involve my bank account. She left angry, muttering about how success had turned me into someone she didn't recognize. Update 2. 2 weeks later, the real consequences started becoming apparent. Mom called to tell me they were losing the house. Without my mortgage payments, they couldn't afford the monthly obligation, and they'd already missed one payment. The bank had sent a notice about the delinquency, and they were facing foreclosure proceedings if they couldn't catch up quickly. She'd found a job working part-time at a department store, but the wages wouldn't come close to covering their expenses. Dad was applying for positions, but his age and health issues were making the search difficult. They'd already canceled their cable subscription and were talking about selling one of their cars to reduce expenses. The conversation was different from her earlier angry voicemails. There was a defeated quality to her voice that I'd never heard before, and she admitted that they'd gotten too comfortable with my financial support. She said she understood why I was angry, but asked if I could at least help them avoid losing the house while they figured out a long-term solution. I told her I'd give them 60 days to find alternative housing, and that I'd cover the mortgage payments during that period to prevent foreclosure. After that, they'd need to either take over the payments themselves or move somewhere they could afford. The house was worth enough that they could sell it and buy something smaller outright if they made smart choices. She thanked me for the 60-day extension, but asked why I couldn't just go back to the way things were before. I reminded her about the comment at dinner, and she finally apologized for what she'd said. She claimed she'd been trying to motivate me to go back to school, not to hurt my feelings or dismiss my accomplishments. I accepted her apology, but explained that the financial arrangement was ending regardless. I'd realized that my generosity had created a dependency that wasn't healthy for any of us, and that it was time for them to take responsibility for their own lives again. Update 3. 6 months later, they'd moved into a small townhouse across town. The rent was manageable on their combined part-time incomes, and they'd sold most of their unnecessary possessions to simplify their lifestyle. Dad found work doing light maintenance at a local business park, and Mom increased her hours at the department store. Our relationship gradually returned to something resembling normal, though dinners were less frequent and always at restaurants where everyone paid their own way. The casual cruelty had disappeared from Mom's comments, replaced by a more respectful acknowledgement of my career success. She'd even started asking for business advice occasionally, genuinely interested in understanding how I'd built my companies. My sister took longer to come around, but eventually admitted that the forced independence had probably been necessary. She'd started contributing a small amount each month to help with their expenses, finally taking some responsibility for their welfare instead of expecting me to handle everything alone. The most surprising change was in Dad. Without the financial stress and shame of depending on his son's charity, he'd become more engaged and energetic. The part-time work was physically manageable, and he seemed to take pride in contributing to their household again. He'd started a small woodworking hobby that brought in occasional extra income, and his overall mood had improved significantly. I kept the house for a few months before selling it to a young family with 2 kids. The profit went into my retirement accounts, money I probably should have been saving all along instead of subsidizing my family's lifestyle. I'd learned the hard way that generosity without boundaries creates resentment on both sides, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is force them to stand on their own feet. Looking back, I think Mom's comment at dinner was the catalyst I'd needed to recognize an unsustainable situation. My financial support had started as a temporary emergency measure and gradually become a permanent crutch that prevented them from adapting to their changed circumstances. The abrupt withdrawal was harsh, but it forced all of us to confront realities we'd been avoiding for years. The degree issue never really got resolved, but it became irrelevant. Success has its own credibility, and watching me build multiple businesses while they struggled to manage basic expenses made the educational debate seem petty and pointless. I'd proven my intelligence through results rather than credentials, and even Mom had to acknowledge that my dropout status hadn't prevented me from becoming the most financially stable person in the family. The experience taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, self-respect, and the difference between helping and enabling. I still help family members when they face genuine emergencies, but the automatic monthly subsidies are gone forever. They know I care about them, but they also know that caring doesn't mean paying for everything anymore. These days, when we have dinner together, everyone contributes to the conversation as equals rather than benefactor and dependents. It's a healthier dynamic, even if it took some painful adjustments to get there. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue people from consequences they need to experience.